Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to another exciting history lesson. Today's lesson is the coming of democracy in South Africa and coming to terms with the past. Now remember, there are lots of sub-themes or subsections that go with this theme of the coming of democracy in South Africa. Please make sure that you know all of them. Don't just learn one, because questions can come from any of them. And then also, there are specific skills that will be taught today, ranging from historical concepts, defining words in your own words, analyzing posters, extracting relevant information, and interpreting sources, their usefulness and limitations. Now, the objectives of the lesson are how to analyze sources, how to apply knowledge to interpret, very important, to interpret information in the sources, how to extract relevant information from the sources, how to evaluate usefulness, reliability, and the limitation of sources, and then how to analyze a poster. So that would be visual source analysis. Now, coupled with the skills, remember that there are specific concepts or keywords that come with this theme that you're supposed to learn, ranging from negotiations, reconciliation, and so on. I won't go over all of them, but you know they go with the theme. Please make sure that you know all of them because you will be expected to define them in your own words. There is also pre-knowledge, information that you will have learned from grade 10 or grade 11 that will help you understand this theme. Knowledge like ideas of race in the late 19th and 20th centuries, South African war, and so on. So please make sure that you remember those. Now, the common errors and misconceptions that we're going to try and address are seeing cause and effect of events, explaining historical concepts in own words, identifying usefulness, reliability, and limitations of sources, and interpreting and analyzing posters. Coupled with that, there are also exam writing competencies that you must know. Things like how to manage your time properly so that you don't run out of time when you write exams, how to interpret sources, and how to write in a way that helps you communicate whatever you want to say. Comprehension of sources is also very important, and active learning. Okay, knowing that when you're reading a source, you have to read it with understanding so that the person reading your answer will know exactly what you're trying to say when it comes to answering those questions. So, we are going to take a very quick commercial break, and when we come back, we are going to look at examples of how to apply those skills. Welcome back. Now, let's look at how you can apply the different skills when answering exam questions. The first thing we're going to look at is historical concepts. Now, the problem here is lack of comprehension of historical concepts. Remember, I showed you those historical concepts or keywords that you should be able to define in your own words. So those concepts range from negotiations, reconciliation, amnesty, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, exile, Government of National Unity, Record of Understanding, Sunset Clause, massacre, democracy, and so on. You have to know those and be able to define them in your own words. So the next thing we're looking at is defining those terms in your own words. So that comes with comprehension of sources and being able to interpret those sources so that you're able to define those terms in your own words. So you'll find that these concepts that I've already looked at, like negotiations, reconciliation, and all that, the terms will be given, the meanings will be given, but then you should be able to then give them in your own words. Please make sure that you do not repeat the words that are given in the source or that are found in the textbook. They should be in your own words. Now, let's look at an example from a past paper. It says, define, so you're giving a definition, define the concept amnesty. And it says here, in your own words. Now, if you read the source, it says, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, was a court-like body assembled in South Africa after the end of apartheid. Anybody who felt they had been a victim of violence could come forward and be heard at the TRC. Perpetrators of violence could also give testimony and request amnesty. So there is the word there appearing in the source. Now you have to define it in your own words. So the possible response there is official pardon. Okay, you have to say it is official. Official pardon for political crimes committed during apartheid in exchange for the disclosure of the whole truth and political motives. Or you can say exempt from prosecution. That's very important for perpetrators who would give testimony on human rights violations that would be proven to have been politically motivated. Now, if you look at both these answers, political motivated or political motives are there because that is also very important. It helps you understand what amnesty was about. That shows that you understand the context as well. Another example says, explain the term reconciliation in the context of the TRC. And you can see the mark allocation there is 2 marks. That means you're just explaining the term. You're not supposed to give examples. Now, let's read this one. It's based on the poster. The caption reads, the poster below was produced by the TRC. It invites both perpetrators and victims to appear before the TRC and testify about human rights abuses that were committed between 1960 and 1994. So even before you look at the poster and analyze it, the caption tells you what the poster is about. Now, let's look at the poster itself to see if it gives us all the information that is contained in the caption. So you have to analyze the poster before you look at the question. So if your mother was tortured, father was murdered, and children abducted, would you be silent? So you can see that this part of the poster encourages people to come and stand before the TRC. And then there's also extra writing here. Let's look at it. It says, let's speak out to each other by telling the truth, by telling us stories of the past so that we can walk the road to reconciliation together. So there is that word that is contained in the question, reconciliation. So you already know that this poster is there to encourage both the victims and perpetrators to come forward and stand before the TRC. And if you look at all the evidence that is contained in the poster, it speaks to that. And then also here, there are words, truth, and then the road to reconciliation. So remember that even though the poster is a visual source, it does contain text or writing that is going to help you answer the question. Now let's look at the question based on this. So remember, the question asked you to define reconciliation in the context of the TRC. Now, if you look at the solution or the possible answers there, it says the state of affairs in which victims and perpetrators, very important to look at that. Victims and perpetrators of human rights abuses would live in peace and harmony, or they would have friendly relations, or reconciliation can also mean restoration. That's another word. Restoration of broken relationships between victims and perpetrators. So it's very, very important to mention that the relationships would have been broken. So now that shows that you understand that they are no longer broken. That means people have reconciled. So that is the meaning of reconciliation. Another possible response or explanation of the word reconciliation is the process through which victims of human rights abuses would have to forgive. So this word forgiveness is very important because how else do you reconcile if you have not forgiven the perpetrator? Okay, so they would have to forgive perpetrators who would have undertaken full disclosure. Now remember, that was one of the expectations of the TRC that the people coming forward before it would have to give full disclosure. So once those people had given full disclosure, the expectation was that the victims would then forgive the perpetrators who would have undertaken full disclosure of human rights abuses they committed. So they committed these human rights abuses. You can see that that is also very important. It comes in both these possible responses. The first response says human rights abuses, and then the next one also speaks to human rights abuses. And then both responses also speak to the coming together of these people. And this one specifically says forgiveness. That's very important. And this one speaks of friendly relations or restoration of broken relationships. So it doesn't matter which one of these two you give, as long as you can point out what happened in the past, the fact that relationships were broken or that they had been unfriendly. You can even use other words like they had been enemies in the past, but now they've decided to move forward. That's another word that is not included in these possible responses that you can use to say that it is about moving forward together, because it shows that these people are now coming together. They used to be enemies before, but now because the perpetrators have come forward to disclose the whole truth. Remember, that was one of the conditions of the TRC. Tell the whole truth and prove that the crimes were politically motivated. So the expectation was that if the perpetrators have done that, they've come forward, they've given full disclosure, they've told the truth, then the victims who were listening to what happened to their loved ones or what happened to themselves then would be able to forgive so that there could be reconciliation. You could also include other things like not just the victims and perpetrators, but the country itself. So reconciliation also referred to the country moving forward together. I hope that has helped you understand how you analyze sources, how you define words in your own, terms in your own words, and also understanding historical concepts. That's very, very important, and that will help you do very well in your exams. We are going to break for another very short commercial break, and when we come back, we are going to look at more examples to teach you how to interpret sources and to succeed in your exams. I will see you shortly. Welcome back. Now, let's look at how you can apply the other history skills when answering exam questions. Now here, the problem is poor comprehension of sources, difficulty extracting relevant information from the sources. Now, I'm going to show you how you can do that successfully. The first thing you need to do, these are the guidelines to help you extract relevant evidence from the sources. You have to highlight the keywords. You have to read the caption because it helps you understand the context. You have to underline the key events and the people because that would show you cause and effect. You also have to read the glossary because the glossary is there to help you understand the difficult terms. And where you're asked to define words in your own words, concept in your own words, or extract relevant evidence, please make sure that you do not use your own knowledge, but you extract the information that is found directly in the sources. Because if you use your own words, then you will be penalized. Now, let's look at our first example. The example says, who, according to the source. So again, remember I said no own knowledge, so please make sure that it is according to the source. Not according to what you know, not according to the textbook, not according to what your teacher told you, but according to the source. So who, according to the source, could come forward and be heard at the TRC? Again, it's very important to look at your mark allocation. There it is 1 mark. Okay, now if you read the source, it says anybody who felt, so I'm just going to underline anybody, who felt they had been a victim of violence could come forward to be heard at the TRC. Perpetrators, that's another one, of violence could also give testimony and request amnesty from prosecution. So now you have to extract those relevant words from the source. Now you can see there, possible answers. It says anybody who felt they had been a victim of violence, and it says perpetrators of violence could also give testimony and request amnesty from prosecution. Now you can see that that is not in your own words, you are not using your own knowledge, but you are taking information directly from the source. Now let's look at another example. This question says, list any 3 mandates of the TRC as stated in the source. So again, please make sure that they are stated in the source. It's not your own knowledge, and look at the mark allocation. So it's out of 3 marks because you are expected to give 3. So the source reads, the mandate of the commission was to bear witness to, record, and in some cases grant amnesty. So you can see bear witness, record, and then in some cases grant amnesty to the perpetrators of crimes relating to human rights violations, reparation, and rehabilitation. Now, if you look at the possible responses there, to bear witness to, remember I did underline that when we were looking at the actual source. To record is there. Grant amnesty, also there. Remember I underlined that one as well. To the perpetrators of crimes relating to human rights violations, and then to also give reparation and rehabilitation. So all that information is directly from the source. It's not using your own knowledge. Now, let's look at other very important history skill, which is interpreting sources, looking at their usefulness, reliability, and limitations. The problem here is that people do not know how to interpret sources. There is also lack of understanding of cause and effect. So, in order to be able to do that, I've given you a set of guidelines to help you interpret the sources. You have to read the caption. Okay, the caption helps you understand context because it tells you who the author was, when the source was made, place of publication, description. All those things will help you determine if the source is reliable and useful and so on. You have to underline key events or actions. You also have to highlight key role players and their actions. Look for reactions or consequences to events. That will help you understand cause and effect. And then if you get visual source, a visual source can be a poster, it can be a cartoon, it can be a photograph. For visual sources, you have to find or look for visual clues that explain the different historical events. That is very important. Now, let's look at our example from a past paper. Why do you think the hearings of the TRC made international news? That is out of 2 marks. Now, the source reads, the hearings made international news and many sessions were broadcast on national television. The TRC was a crucial component of the transition to full and free democracy in South Africa, and despite some flaws, is generally regarded as very successful. That is what the source says. But then you need to say why you think the hearings gained international attention. Possible responses, it was newsworthy, or it was of international interest. The international communities wanted to see how South Africa wanted to address the atrocities of the past. So there is the international communities there. You could also say the international communities wanted to see whether the restorative justice system that the TRC employed would work. The international communities were concerned about how this process would unfold in South Africa. Or you could say the international communities wanted to see how South Africa, so how is very important, how South Africa dealt with the perpetrators who committed gross human rights violations. So it's any possible answer there. Now, another very important skill is looking at limitations of sources. So when you're asked to do that, you have to look for the author. Who wrote the source? When was the source written? Why was it written? Who published it? And then you need to look at content. Which words or language is used, and then which information is left out or omitted. So all those things are going to tell you whether a source is useful and what its limitations are, and whether it is reliable or not. Let's look at an example. This question reads, explain the usefulness. Okay, this is a higher order thinking skill. Explain the usefulness of this source for a historian researching the murder of anti-apartheid activist Griffiths Mxenge. Now, don't forget to look at the mark allocation. Now, here it says 2 times 2 equals 4. That means you have to give 2 explanations there. Okay, now, if you look at the caption, it says the extract below is part of the testimony that Dirk Coetzee, the death squad commander at Vlakplaas, gave at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's TRC's public hearing into the murder of political activist Griffiths Mxenge. The hearing was held in Durban on 5 November 1996. So that is the caption that gives you the context of what the source says. Now, if you look at the possible responses, the source is useful because it is a transcript that gives first-hand information about the murder of Griffiths Mxenge. The testimony was from Dirk Coetzee. The caption does say that, remember, who had become the Vlakplaas death squad commander. That information is contained in the caption. The testimony took place on 5 November 1996, which is exactly when public hearings of the TRC were held. Another possible response is that the source gives us insight into the method the special forces used to kill Griffiths Mxenge, including names, okay, remember the name Dirk Coetzee is there in the caption, of those responsible for this murder. So those are all the possible responses. Now let's look at another very important skill. This one is how to analyze posters. Now, you've already seen this poster, and I did highlight very important words. The question is, why did the TRC decide to produce this poster? If you read the caption, the poster below was produced by the TRC. It invites both perpetrators and victims to appear before the TRC and testify about human rights abuses that were committed between 1960 and 1994. Okay, now I hope you do remember this poster. I read all this information that is contained there and the words that are there that spoke about the need for reconciliation, encouraging people to come forward. Now, the possible responses: to encourage or to appeal to or invite people, that is both victims and perpetrators, to come forward and tell their stories of human rights abuses, to establish a record, that's very important, of human rights atrocities committed during the apartheid regime, to produce an opportunity for victims to come forward to voice out the nature and extent of harm they had suffered so that they could be compensated and their dignity restored, to show that the government was committed to the healing of the wounds from atrocities committed during apartheid, to foster reconciliation between perpetrators and victims in South Africa, and to make people aware of the work of the TRC. Now, let's look at examples from past papers to show you how you can apply both your knowledge and skills when answering questions. The first question reads, according to the source. Now remember, when the question says according to the source, please make sure you do not use your own knowledge. Use the source. Why did the National Party support the idea of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC? And look at the mark allocation. It's 1 times 2 equals 2. Now, the source reads, the National Party supported the idea of the Reconciliation Commission, TRC, in order, it's there, to avoid responsibility. Their approach was built around the concept of amnesty. Okay, so this is also very important. In their view, a disclosure of past misdeeds should be rewarded, I'm going to highlight that, underline it, with exemption or exclusion from prosecution. It wasn't that simple. Black South Africans were entirely justified in their demands for explanations. Furthermore, the vehicle of their liberation, the African National Congress, ANC, was now in power. The scope and nature of the commission would be determined by Mandela and his government. Now let's look at a possible response there. You're just extracting information from the source as it is. It says, in order to avoid responsibility. Remember, I did underline that when we were looking at the actual source. Now let's look at another example. Another example says, what, according to the source, again, this is according to the source, it's not according to your own knowledge, it's according to the source, were the opinions of the following, okay, what, according to the source, were the opinions of the following regarding the granting of general amnesty by the TRC? The first one is de Klerk, and then the next one is the ANC. Now let's look at the possible responses. Before we do that, let's look at the source. F.W. de Klerk maintains that he was of the opinion that a process was required in order to enable South Africans to come to terms with the conflict of the past in a spirit of reconciliation and to get on with the future. That's very important. Get on with the future without recriminations or accusations. He is known to have favored a general amnesty for perpetrators of politically inspired violence. A general amnesty went very much against ANC thinking. So you can see both de Klerk and ANC are mentioned in the source, and it shows you what they wanted. Now let's look at possible response from that question. Now, the first one is de Klerk. De Klerk was of the opinion that the process was required in order to enable South Africans to come to terms with the conflict of the past in a spirit of reconciliation and to get on with the future without recriminations or accusations. Remember, I did underline that when we looked at the source. Okay, and then the next one is the ANC. The ANC favored a general amnesty for perpetrators of politically inspired violence. So you can see that it's straight extracting of information from the source. Okay, it's a general amnesty went very much against ANC thinking. Okay, now let's look at another example. Why do you think Black South Africans demanded explanations from the perpetrators and not only disclosure by the National Party? That is just 1 point out of 2 marks. Okay, now let's look at the possible response that you can give there. This is interpreting evidence from the source. Very important. Most injustices committed in the past by the apartheid government were against Black people. So it's very, very important to note that. So that is why Black people would feel that way, who demanded explanations to find closure. Another possible response is the amnesty process led to those who tortured, okay, I'm going to underline, those who tortured and killed Black activists to be scot-free. So that is why Black people demanded to know what happened, because their feeling was that those people who were responsible for torturing and killing Black activists had gone scot-free. Another possible response is the high command of the security forces who issued instructions to kill activists was not held accountable. That is also very, very important, that it wasn't just the people who committed the crimes, in other words, the perpetrators, but the high command as well. So in other words, those people who were in charge, the high command of the security forces. Another possible response here is that families of victims did not always get the whole truth. Okay, I'm going to underline, did not always get the whole truth of what happened to their loved ones. So obviously, if people did not get the whole truth, they would not be happy with the process, because if your loved one was killed, you would want to know the whole truth of what happened to them. Another possible response that you can give is that they wanted to hear from perpetrators themselves. This is very important. So not just the National Party, not just the government, but those people who had committed the crimes, the expectation was that they themselves needed to come forward and explain why they did what they did, what happened to the remains of their loved ones. You will know all this information from having studied the TRC, that in some cases, the bodies of the loved ones were hidden, and the families of the victims wanted to know where those bodies were hidden. They also wanted to know why the loved ones were killed. So all that information is very, very important in order to interpret the evidence from the source. I hope that has helped you understand how to answer questions in an exam situation, and also where you're asked to use the source, please make sure you use the source. You do not use your own knowledge or your own thinking, but extract relevant information from the source. So what we are going to do now, we are going to break for a very short commercial break, and when we come back, we are going to look at more practice questions to help you apply your exam techniques so that you do very, very well in the examinations. I will see you shortly. Welcome back. Now let's look at more examples to help you apply your skills and exam techniques in answering exam questions. Now let's look at this question. It says, explain why you think this photograph was taken. So now you look at the mark allocation, 2 times 2 equals 4. That means you have to give 2 reasons why you think the photograph was taken. So I'm going to show you the photograph and how to analyze it. But before we do that, let's look at the caption. This source shows Hawa Timol, mother of Ahmed Timol, giving evidence at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. It was held on 30th April 1996 at the Methodist Church in Johannesburg. Remember, it's very important to read the caption, highlight keywords, underline important events, so that you know even before you look at the photograph, you know exactly what the photograph is about. So, this is the photograph. You can see this is the mother of Ahmed Timol there. You can see she is crying, so look at the facial expression. There, she's holding what looks like a handkerchief, wiping her nose because she is crying. You can also see this person next to her consoling because they have their arm, there's their arm there, showing that they are consoling, and also their facial expression as well. You can also see people around with headphones to show that they are listening. So this shows that it was at the TRC hearing, but it also shows the emotion that is going on here as the mother is hearing and giving evidence. So now, if you look at the possible response, the photograph was taken to show that Hawa Timol gave evidence at the TRC on the murder of her son Ahmed Timol. Another possible response, to show grief or heartache that Hawa Timol endured while giving evidence. Remember, I did highlight the handkerchief and the facial expression showing that she was crying. Another possible response is to show that Hawa Timol was still searching for the truth. So that is why she appeared before the TRC. So those are all the reasons why that photograph was taken. Another question, comment on why Howard Timol decided to appear before the TRC. 2 times 2. That is the mark allocation. Possible response there, she wanted to know who was responsible for the murder of her son. So obviously she didn't know. She came forward before the TRC in order to know who was responsible for the murder of her son. She wanted to know the truth about the murder of her son. Remember, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was about uncovering the truth. And she also wanted to find closure. Very, very important. So any 2 of these are possible responses you could give. So that is how you interpret the sources. Now let's look at a different type of question, and this is now an essay type question. So the question reads, explain to what extent political leadership and commitment by key South African role players paved the way for the birth of a non-racial democratic South Africa in 1994. And then you have to support your line of argument. So I'm going to highlight line of argument here because you have to give your own independent line of argument, but you must make sure that even though it is an independent line of argument, there is relevant evidence that you can use to support this. Now, that evidence can come from you having read the sources, but mostly from you having studied this section. So it's very, very important, and please don't forget to give the extent as well, because the question says to what extent. So if you just answer without giving the extent, that means your essay is not an argument, but it is just a narrative. Remember, when you're writing essays in history, you're arguing, you are not just retelling the story. So you have to show your line of argument and then support it with the relevant evidence there. So you have to plan and construct your original argument based on relevant evidence using your analytical and interpretative skills. So you need to explain to what extent political leadership and, so to what extent, as I've already told you, and commitment by key South African role players paved the way for the birth of a non-racial democratic South Africa. Remember to use relevant evidence to support that. So you could include the following aspects in your response. In the introduction, please indicate how political leadership and commitment of key South African role players paved the way for the birth of a non-racial democratic South Africa. So in other words, you need to take a stance there and also give the extent. Now, you need to elaborate, okay, and by giving relevant information. So the following are just some of the few points that you can give. So you will need to add more in line with the mark allocation because remember, you will have studied for this. So these are just some of the relevant points. De Klerk comes to power in 1989. Just brief background on that. The unbanning of political and civic organizations such as the ANC and SACP. So those are the reforms that the F.W. de Klerk introduced as soon as he came to power. Apartheid legislation revoked, such as the Separate Reservation of Amenities Act, that is also part of the reforms introduced by F.W. de Klerk. Political leadership and commitment there, it does show, because he was a political leader. Record of understanding signed, very important to mention that, on the 26th of September 1992 between Rolf Meyer, representing the National Party, and Cyril Ramaphosa, representing the ANC. So again, that shows political leadership and commitment, because you can see Rolf Meyer represented the National Party and Cyril Ramaphosa represented the ANC. So that shows political leadership and their commitment because they signed the Record of Understanding. Assassination of Chris Hani on the 10th of April 1993 and its impact on South Africa. Their political leadership killed. Election date was announced the 27th of April 1994. The ANC then won, you can see ANC there, won elections, and Mandela, there is your leadership, became the first black South African president. So those are some of the points that you need to include in your essay. Remember, you can add more there. So once you've looked at all your different main points, and remember these main points have to be in different paragraphs, one idea, one paragraph, then what you can do is you can write your conclusion. Now remember, the conclusion is there to tie up your argument with the relevant conclusion. Remember, when you're writing a conclusion, you are summing up your main points. You are not rewriting the essay. Please remember that you cannot include new information in your conclusion. If there is something, if there's some points that you forgot to include in the body of your essay, please do not just sneak them into the conclusion, because the conclusion is there to tie up. Just like the introduction is there to introduce your essay, the conclusion is there to sum up your argument. So no new ideas in the conclusion, okay? You just sum up your main points, and then you use that relevant evidence that you will have used in the body of your essay. I hope that has helped you understand how to write a good essay and interpret sources and use relevant evidence from the sources so that you can do very, very well in your exams. So now what we are going to do is we are going to break for another short commercial break, and when we come back, we are going to wrap up our lesson by reminding you what we looked at from the beginning. I will see you shortly. Welcome back. Now, let's quickly wrap up our lesson by recapping on what we looked at. So, this lesson was the coming of democracy in South Africa and coming to terms with the past. Remember, I told you that there are subsections that you have to know, like secret negotiations, affidavit to clerks reforms, talks about talks, CODESA 1, ongoing violence, CODESA 2, and the Government of National Unity. Please make sure that you know all of them, because questions in the exam can come from any of these. We also looked at different skills that are very important in history, like historical concepts, defining terms and concepts in your own words, how to analyze posters, how to extract relevant information and evidence from the sources, and how to interpret sources looking at their usefulness, reliability, and their limitations. And then we also looked at the different keywords that go with this theme, from negotiation to reconciliation, amnesty, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, exile, Government of National Unity, Record of Understanding, Sunset Clause, massacre, and democracy. Please make sure that you know these and you are able to define them in your own words. We also highlighted common errors that people make, like how to see cause and effect in history, how to interpret sources and look for their usefulness, reliability, and limitations. Another problem, explaining historical terms in own words, and how to analyze posters. We looked at all those questions and we applied those skills. And remember, I told you that coupled with the specific skills for history, there are exam writing skills like critical thinking, reading skills, time management so that you don't run out of time and not answer all the questions, interpretation skills so that you interpret your sources, and then the most important one is communication skills, where whatever you write, make sure that the marker understands what you're trying to say. Comprehension skills goes with interpreting sources. Active learning, don't just read the source, aimlessly. You have to read it actively to make sure that you understand it so that you are able to interpret it. So those are very important exam techniques. Now, as a bonus, I've given you further exam questions that you can use to practice all these skills that we've looked at today, so that now in your own time, on your own, you are able to practice and revise for exams. So these are the questions 2.2.1 all the way to 2.2.3 using sources 2B and 2C, just to help you understand how to apply these very important skills and exam techniques so that you are successful in your exams. I hope today's lesson has helped you understand how to analyze questions in history, how to answer questions in an exam situations so that you do very, very well. I wish you all the best, and I'm confident that you're all going to get the results you deserve and make us all proud. Until we meet again, I wish you all the best, good luck, and it's goodbye from me.